from the schools into your own backyard. And I have to apologize for tonight that I'm going to be a little on the bossy side. I'm not normally like that. Don't ask my family though, okay? And I'm going to be telling you things that I don't want you to plant in your home landscape, but I'll give you lots of examples of things that I think would be wonderful for you to plant, especially if you want your home garden to be a more ecological space. So let's get started. Here's where I work. This is the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We work to empower people to restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie in lots of different contexts. We have several programs that all work together toward this goal. And I happen to manage the one that's called Plant Materials, the Plant Materials Program. And what we do in this program is we help native seed growers grow and produce Iowa source seed by initially starting out by collecting seed from some of the remnant prairies that are left in Iowa that haven't been plowed. We produce seed in fields at the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and then we release that seed to native seed growers who produce it in large quantities. So I'm producing maybe a few pounds of seed a year from a species, and then the native seed growers produce what goes on the roadsides and into the CRP programs and all of those kinds of things. One note is that even though I'm talking tonight at a community event, we do not sell seed or plants to the public, but the native seed and plant growers would be happy to do that. And at the end of my talk, I'll have some resources for you to find those people. So we believe at the TPC that returning prairie to the landscape has many benefits. And when you think about those larger scale restorations like this, this planting that you can see on the slide, they provide benefits on the scale of watersheds. They help to reduce erosion and the nutrient pollution of our waterways. They reduce runoff, and they increase the capacity of watersheds to handle rainfall in general. But okay, what does that have to do with our yards and gardens? Yeah, you know, they intercept rainfall too. But I think we need to start thinking about our lawns and gardens as more than spaces that should be, you know, manicured and that should fit an aesthetic that's outdated. So this is one of my favorite memes. You've probably seen it before, but I gotta keep sharing it. I don't dress like that. You can tell I'm in my flannels, and my lawn doesn't look like that, because this is on the right is the backyard of our house with a prairie planting and a very relaxed looking person in the background. So I believe that our lawns and gardens can contribute to a much healthier environment for people and other living things as well. So let's think beyond our old aesthetic. So who and what are gardens for? Well, of course, they are for people of all ages. They're for us. They're for beauty, for relaxation and play. Sometimes they give us food. We've heard about that tonight, and flowers for the table. They're places for us to meet each other, talk with neighbors and friends. They can also be for wildlife by providing shelter and food for birds and butterflies and bees. They can do more things for the environment that we share with all life. They can help filter rainwater, store carbon, and reduce runoff. They can provide a healthier environment for kids to grow up in and learn about their connections to other living things. I always love sharing this picture. You'll probably see it in every talk that I give, because these are two of my sons admiring one of the butterflies that they reared and released onto a milkweed plant in our garden. These kids are now, let me see, 22 and 25. So Doug Tallamy is a writer and speaker in this area, and I love some of his quotes. He says, in the past, we have asked one thing of our gardens, that they be pretty. Now they have to support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. It's a lot for a garden to do, and they can still be pretty. So how can we make our gardens more meaningful? And I think this takes a change of mindset in addition to some concrete actions that we can take. So let's start with the mindset first. First thing we got to do is change our expectations about what's beautiful, because our gardens can serve much more than our own personal needs at the time through these steps. So change our expectations. Things shouldn't look perfect. Look at the bug holes in those tree leaves. Bugs, aren't bugs awful? I mean, when leaves look chewed, that means insects are eating them, and well, those insects are their food for the rest of the food chain, including songbirds. So if you look at the bird in the left, that's a house wren, And it's caught a caterpillar in our yard and is getting ready to feed it to its young that are living in a dead plum tree that we've got next to the garden. So Doug Tallamy, whom I quoted on the previous page, he once documented that it takes 6,000 caterpillars to raise one brood of little chickadees. And the wrens, I think, are very similar. This was a very busy bird. And now if you think about it this way, when we plant things the caterpillars can eat, we will see more holes in leaves, but the birds help keep things in balance, and we're feeding the birds. So my second point is, let's embrace diversity. We need to not just have lots of different species in our yards, but lots of structure in our yards, like vertical layers with trees and shrubs and plants for both shade and sun. It kind of fits in with what Steve Eilers was telling us about having shade that helps to help some of our lawn and our other garden plants to grow. We also need to plant species that will produce flowers throughout the seasons and leave stalks in the garden as winter interest for us, and also places for insects to overwinter and where birds can find nutritious food. And finally, plant native plants. Tallamy's research has showed that if you have a landscape with 70% or more native plants, you're going to support a lot more of the songbirds. So native plants are adapted to our climate and our soils. They're part of the heritage of our state. This is a prairie rose, which is our state flower, and they have complex relationships with other native species such as insects. But you want more insects? Ugh, bugs. But yeah, they support the whole food web. So we already talked about songbirds. Predatory insects like firefly larvae help control pest populations, and pollinators help native plants reproduce along with agricultural and horticultural crops that feed us. But yeah, okay, native plants, great, you know, bugs, birds. How much does one little garden really matter? Well, this picture on the right shows a rusty-patched bumblebee. This is a federally listed endangered species that is present in the Cedar Valley. It's one of these kind of semi-isolated populations, we think now. This was taken in my backyard feeding on blue lobelia, a native plant. And on the left, you can see a map of sightings of these bees on Iowa. A lot of the sightings are clustered around our urban and suburban areas. And partly that's because that's where you've got people who are looking for the bees, but also you've got a lot of diverse habitat there. So by working together as lots of gardeners in suburban and urban landscapes, we can really make a difference. So another quote from Tallamy: chances are you never thought of your garden, indeed all of your property, as a wildlife preserve that presents the last chance we have for sustaining plants and animals that were once common throughout the US. But that is exactly the role our suburban landscapes are playing. So Tallamy has a project that's called Homegrown National Park. I encourage you to check it out. And see, they have a goal of converting half of the lawn area in the US, which is 400 million acres of lawns that we have. Half of that, 20 million of it, would be a habitat larger than the two largest national parks put together. So the rest of this talk is going to be looking at the common functions that we'd like our gardens to have. And I'm going to tell you some of the things I don't want you to plant, but I'm also going to give you lots of options that you can use that are native plants that can replace those functions and maybe even do them better and feed the birds and the bees and the butterflies. So first off, I know we're all hankering for the spring blooms, but please don't plant a Bradford or Kellery pear. This is an invasive bully of a plant that goes out and takes over native systems and is really hard to control. Besides, the flowers don't smell good, so yeah, let's plant some other things instead, like the Native American plum, which has lots of, it has very similar looking flowers and lots of benefits for our native pollinators, as well as the things that eat the fruit later on. A redbud is technically just native to southern Iowa, but they're doing pretty well here, especially with climate change, and have lots of benefits for early season pollinators. They're one of the first things to bloom. Pagoda dogwood is, surprisingly enough, it's a native plant. Lovely flowers in the spring for early pollinators, berries in the fall. Same with our native viburnums. And I want to put in a plug for the Iowa crabapple. If you can find one, they are incredible, and the smell is like nothing else, except maybe my grandma's hand lotion. It smells a little bit like that. Okay, so when you have all those beautiful flowering trees, you're going to want something to plant under them as a ground cover, especially in the deep shade where the grass isn't going to grow well. But I'm going to ask you, please don't plant the vinca. And here's a mea culpa. I have planted vinca before. I still have some. I'm yanking it out and I'm replacing it. Here are some things you can replace it with. Wild ginger. This is a lovely ground cover that will spread somewhat, but you know, it's also easy to control. Bloodroot that blooms early spring. Virginia waterleaf blooms a little later in the spring. It has kind of two flushes of leaves. It's an interesting plant. And the common blue violet, you may not even have to plant it. You may just have to stop spraying it out. And speaking of early spring color, there's a lot of bulbs that you can still plant, but please avoid this one. Siberian squill is invasive. Another one that I accidentally planted and now have to get rid of. But instead of it, you can plant Virginia bluebells for that gorgeous blue color. And to complement them, since the bluebell's foliage dies out later in the spring, plant some marybells. And how about some wild sweet William, maybe some false Solomon seal and wild geranium, and maybe dotted throughout those some sedges for their fine leaf texture. We'll see some of those later. All of these things not only provide that color that we crave, but they provide resources for our native bees, and especially the newly emerging bumblebee queens in the spring that have to start a colony out all by themselves. Okay, so let's talk about texture in the garden, and grasses are so wonderful for that, and for providing habitat and for food for certain kinds of caterpillars. But let's not go with the invasive silver grass. Even as pretty as it is, it forms really dense single species stands that crowd out other things and don't provide good habitat. Instead, you could plant the perennial plant of the year. The Perennial Plant Association has recognized little bluestem for its many wonderful qualities, and I think its fall color is exceptional. Sideoats grama grass is another native grass that has a shorter stature. Same with prairie dropseed, which has the bonus of smelling like buttered popcorn if you like it, and like dirty socks if you don't like it, but only when it's flowering. So, you know, just be aware. And Indian grass with those beautiful golden plumes. Now that one's a true tall grass. You want to have a big space for that. The sedges are not to be overlooked. These are amazing cool season grass-like plants. Copper-shouldered oval sedge like sun, graze sedge, and long-beaked sedge prefer the shade. Okay, if you like cut flowers in your garden, purple loosestrife is pretty, but it's invasive in wetlands, and we know we don't like invasive bullies here. So plant this instead, prairie blazing star. And these options, which you may also already have in your garden, sweet black-eyed Susan, wild quinine, stiff goldenrod, and rattlesnake master, all native prairie plants that really add to that home landscape. Oh, and a plug for the goldenrods, they don't cause the allergies, they just happen to bloom at the same time as ragweed. Okay, let's feed the butterflies, but let's not give them junk food. Butterfly bush just supplies nectar for that, truthfully, butterflies really love, but no caterpillars that are native to this area can feed on the foliage. So it's just like a vending machine and not providing any good food for butterflies. So let's leave that one off. And instead, you could plant meadow blazing star. Look at the monarchs on that stuff. It's like a monarch magnet. You could have Joe Pyeweed. I once saw 7 species of butterflies on a Joe Pyeweed patch at one time. Golden Alexander's blooms early in the spring when the eastern-tailed blues first come out. Smooth blue aster blooms late in the year when things like this orange sulfur were out. And bee balm is called bee balm, but the butterflies love it too. So there you have it. And please do, I'm done with my don'ts, I think, but please do plant butterfly baby food like milkweeds for the monarchs, golden alexanders for the swallowtails, native sunflowers and coneflowers for the checker spots, and pussy toes for the painted ladies. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I do have one more don't. Please don't plant euonymus burning bush. It's invasive. And that's another one that I'm having to cut out of my yard because I love this stuff, but I don't want it anymore because I know the harm it does. Instead, plant American hazelnut and American hop hornbeam for fall color. How about native dogwoods? Or even some of our native prairie plants have beautiful fall color, even though they're not trees or shrubs. Here's stiff goldenrod. We've seen that in a previous picture, red fall leaves. And the prairie plants show us that even blue can be a beautiful fall color. That's a bottle gentian. And then the color doesn't stop with the fall. As we head into winter, we also have plants that give us great winter interest. I would say plant wild indigo for that kind of metallic sheen. It almost looks like it's made of pewter to me. Stiff goldenrod again. Look at it catching the snow, so charming. And golden alexander's another one of those plants we've seen in several slides here, catching little tufts of snow in its inflorescence. And bee balm once again. And even the grasses can look really beautiful in the frost and snow. And when you leave those stalks standing, you also leave homes for the insects that live inside those stalks and for the birds that feed on them. This is something I hadn't seen before. I took this picture, a downy woodpecker finding larvae inside the stalk of a compass plant. So one thing is that a lot of the plants that I told you not to plant are commonly available, but the ones that I showed you to plant are a little bit harder to find. But you can find on the Tallgrass Prairie Center website, you can find the Plant Iowa Native Resources, and it's going to give you seed and plant suppliers from Iowa and from surrounding states. Also for the trees and shrubs, check out the Iowa DNR State Forestry Nursery. And there's a commercial business called Iowa Native Trees and Shrubs that has a wonderful selection, and you should check it out. I want to thank the partners and funders of the Tallgrass Prairie Center, without whom we couldn't do our work. And finally, leave you with a few other resources for learning more. And I think, my goodness, thank you for your attention. I don't know about you, but I'm up past my bedtime, and I'll look for some questions.